Bonjour, good morning, Dumelang, Assalamu alaikum, because I think we represent the diversity of Africa here today. Program Director, Your Excellency Mayor Msimanga, other mayors and senior officials from cities across the African continent, Councillor Tao, both the head of SALGA and the UCLG, my colleague, the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, and High Commissioners and other diplomats that are present, guests and ladies and gentlemen. Let me firstly thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me to share a few thoughts on the question of responsible leadership and how we lay the foundations for investment. And investment, of course, is a very broad topic at the end of the day. But the concept of responsible leadership began to emerge in the Western world amongst the so-called captains of industry and government when the World Economic Forum started talking about responsive and responsible leadership. And that arose from a recognition that there was a crisis that has been brewing in the world, and indeed in our own continent as well, which crisis begins to communicate a message which says that there's a growing alienation between business and political elites on the one hand and citizens on the other hand. It's a recognition which says that that alienation is caused by growing inequality, a growing perception that those who live in the top echelons are enjoying things that other groups in society are not actually enjoying. And in different countries, it will take different forms, and this gap in inequality, in opportunity, in access to resources, and above all, economic advancement takes different forms as well. And responsible and responsive leadership began to emerge as a concept or a slogan which said that leaders in society should take cognizance of this unfolding reality. Secondly, recognize the fact that this kind of alienation between citizens and elites is not a good thing to have in any country. Thirdly, that kind of alienation could result in negative political consequences. And you can see that's happening in many parts of the Western world at the moment, where as a result of middle and lower classes being left out of and not benefiting from economic growth and the distribution of the benefits of economic growth, political choices are being made by citizens which are causing great concern, whether it's the results of elections in the United States or the results of the Brexit referendum, and then more recently the elections in the United Kingdom as well, and certain forms of government that have developed within the continent of Europe as well. So from our point of view, ladies and gentlemen, governance and becoming responsive and responsible leaders in a local government context is an extremely important area to apply our minds to. As the Minister was pointing out and the Mayor before her pointed out, cities, towns, and indeed even villages are becoming increasing magnets for people to assemble around, whether there's housing available or not. And that's why today we do have the phenomenon of sprawl in cities and, if you like, even borderless cities developing. But why do we have this magnet or magnetic attraction that cities provide? You have this attraction because in many ways cities are seen as points where economic opportunity and the possibilities of enterprise are in fact concentrated. So people not only come there because of curiosity, as has been mentioned, but also out of hopefulness. They hope that by getting to a city, they will get economic opportunities. That by getting to a city or a town, their aspirations and expectations of a better life and of becoming involved and benefiting from economic activity would be something that they would be able to experience as well. As has also been pointed out, and I'm sure you know from your own experience, urbanization is now a global phenomenon. Even on the African continent, by 2050, more than 60 or 70% of our population will be urbanized. It therefore means that Africa is not going to be an exception in terms of the patterns of urbanization and the relationship between urban centers and rural areas that are idiosyncratic of our own situation as well. But cities and towns are also hubs where investment takes place. That is where infrastructure is invested upon. That is where either local or foreign companies will base their businesses, and where local populations, as I said earlier on, look for economic opportunities and synergies between what they might have to offer and what others might have to offer. So there's absolutely no doubt that badly planned cities, and certainly the kind of cities that we have in South Africa as a result of our legacy of apartheid, where the majority didn't have access to cities, particularly this one. I also first came here in 1991, and all I could see was khaki safari suits, walking around with the old-style leather briefcases. So it was a strange experience that I had as well at that particular point in time. But I think for all of us, the recognition is certainly there that a better organized city, a city where there's an agglomeration of people in an organized and planned way, in fact offers more economic opportunities to people, particularly young people, and enables them to, in a sense, hope for a better quality of life and standard of life as well, which is what you as leaders of cities and others who are in government carry as their responsibility. But cities have to be well governed if at the end of the day we are to become the conveyors of hope, the people whose decisions will in fact facilitate the kind of achievement of aspirations that the majority of our people would have and the expectations that they have from our cities and urban centers as well. So cities, in a sense, represent, as I said, optimism, the possibility of something actually happening, and in some instances where we are not adequately offering the right kind of leadership, the right kind of vision, the right kind of planning, and the right ability to accommodate people that are coming to our cities, we also have cities becoming centers of despair and disappointment as well. And it's how we increasingly get the right governance patterns going, which I'm sure you'll discuss over the next 2 days, and ensure that there's democratic participation as part of the kind of leadership that we offer to our own populations that will determine whether we earn the respect of our population and do the things that they actually expect of us. As you know, there's, over the last 10 years or so, been a huge amount of expectation of the African continent. You would also know that we've developed our own slogans, Africa Rising. Africa is the next center of economic growth, of the multipolar world, and of having significant influence, not only in respect of our own lives, of the billion people that we have, but being a player, both economically speaking and politically speaking, in the globe as a whole. But for us to play that kind of role, we need to constantly ensure that as municipal leaders in this instance, we are able to stay ahead of the curve of history and ensure that our thinking as leaders is equally world-class, that we're not afraid to humble ourselves to learn from others about how things could be done better, whilst at the same time insisting that whatever we learn has to be adapted to our own African circumstances. So in our kind of context, what is that relationship between responsible leadership and us investing in the right things, but also inviting investment in the right things in our continent? In the first instance, it's very clear that responsible leaders need to be activist leaders. They're not just people who should wear gowns and chains around their neck, and forgive me if some of you might be doing that, but we need to be activists in the sense that we have a mission to accomplish. And there's a sense of urgency that that mission needs to have attached to it in order that as quickly as possible we create livable cities, sustainable cities, cities that are vibrant in an economic sense, but in a cultural sense as well. It means that as leaders, we need a keen grasp of where we come from historically and where we are going to, historically speaking, as well. So what will indeed the fourth industrial revolution look like when it starts beginning to impact upon some of our cities and then others as well? So leaders need a grasp of where they're coming from, the current reality that they are confronted with, and the possibilities that that reality offers, so that those realities are exploited in the right way, not only for the benefit of the few, but for the benefit of the many. The second element in respect of responsible leadership, and which is something that increasingly citizens all over the world will judge political and economic leaders by. Do you work for all of us, or do you work for yourself? That's going to be the qualifying factor. And that is why throughout the world today, including what we've just heard as the first of the 7 aspirations in terms of Agenda 2063, inclusive growth is the slogan that you will hear repeatedly. And what does that mean? It means we don't want a GDP number or a growth pattern or a growth dynamic that benefits only a few. Because when it does that, you can see the after effects of that in other parts of the world. And when it does that, it actually excludes the majority. And the majority around the world is demonstrating that they're not going to be forever patient with political and economic elites. At some stage or the other, they will rise, they will raise their voices, they will use their votes, and they will speak with that. So that the question for bold and responsible leadership is, how are we going to become proactive? How do we anticipate the right things to do in order to create the right conditions for our people and for ourselves as well? And so leadership in that context means we need some idea of what our cities are going to look like 30 years from now. And what is the planning that needs to back up that kind of vision that will ensure that in an organized way we go and achieve that vision of the city, although there will be twists and turns as we move in that direction. Leadership is also about getting the right balance between our careers as politicians on the one hand, and the public interest and the national interest on the other hand. I don't think we must fool ourselves. We are in politics because we also have aspirations. Mr. Msimanga didn't want to remain on the committees that he was talking about earlier on his CV. He wanted to become mayor. And so he canvassed very hard in Swane and he beat my political party here. But we'll have to rectify that in the future. And in that way, there's no doubt that there are so-called professional politicians in every country. But if we focus only on ourselves and focus only on our self-interest and the interests of our few friends, then we have today a public that is very alive to that they understand when you're working for them and they understand when you work for yourselves. And so responsible leadership in this context, particularly if you want to create the right climate for economic development and investment, means that we need to understand what public service means and make a commitment to that. Above all, for us on the African continent, we have interesting possibilities as countries that have been decolonized over a period of time, ours being amongst the most recent of them, and liberated from the apartheid system, to demonstrate in line with the values that we have amongst our people on the continent, what does social justice mean as part of an economic, political, and social program? In other words, can we demonstrate as African cities and as African leaders that we can offer better examples of social justice than the rest of the world, where there's greater levels of equity, there is greater justice amongst our people, where there aren't extremely poor and extremely rich people as the divide that we have in a country, and that we actually have everyone benefiting from the kind of public and private investments that we make. And the key for us is to ensure that great temptation of politicians and of economic elites, where they club together, they play golf together, they attend the same cocktail parties together, they attend the same dinners together, and they create the opportunities for making secret deals together. I'm sure we all know about these things, right? But that's not the pattern of responsible leadership. That pattern of responsible leadership has to change. Otherwise, it will be changed for us by our own citizens. And there are many examples that we will come across in that particular regard. So some of the qualities, if I may humbly suggest to you, of responsible leadership is the ability to listen to our citizens, not necessarily obey everything they say, but listening is a very important skill. The ability to be open to learning. There's a book by an author who writes a lot about companies that fail and succeed called Jim Collins. And there's a little book that he's published in about 2009, How the Mighty Fall. And he gives 5 diagnostics as to how the mighty fall. I'll only talk about one of them. And the first one that he describes in this little book, which you should get hold of, by the way, it's got some nice life lessons for all of us, is hubris. And hubris means you become so preoccupied with your own agenda and become so overconfident and arrogant about it that actually denies you the opportunity to understand when things are going wrong. It denies you the opportunity to listen to outsiders who are actually saying to you, beware, there's a danger that's coming along. And you've had a very nice example of that, ladies and gentlemen, just a few days ago last week in the British elections. Right? Where a leader decides, I'm going out there, I want a 60-seat majority, and ends up with less seats than they had originally. Okay? So, hubris is something that all of us, as leaders, need to avoid. Humility is another quality. The practical demonstration to our people that we are serious about public service is yet another quality. And the ability to sacrifice in the interest of the larger good is obviously key. And one of the big mistakes that leaders make, which has also been amplified during the past week as well, is the ability to listen to good advice and to put a diversity of views around one so that you have a diversity of views expressed to us, and you can then choose what's the right thing to do in a particular set of circumstances. In South Africa, we would use the word ziyabas, so I put people around me who will only say things I like and will only tell me how great I am, will not point out the mistakes I am making, will not point out the dangers that actually lie there. And that is actually not the kind of service that you want. You want skilled professionals around you who can guide you on both technical and political issues and ensure that we create the right climate for economic development and let alone social development as well. One of the key things in relation to investment into the future that all leaders will be confronted with is how do you manage short-term demands and medium-term investment. See, what we do in cities, it doesn't just last 1 year. When you develop a new housing area, it's there for the next 100 years. When you develop a new major highway, that's also going to outlive all of us once we've actually completed that particular project. So many of the things that we do actually have long-term implications. At the same time, if there's a flood or fires, as we've seen in South Africa in the last couple of days, or other emergencies, we have to respond to those as well. And so leadership in this particular instance also requires that our investment decisions in our cities are wisely made. They respond both to the immediate needs that we have on the one hand, but also are in line with that vision that we talked about earlier on, so that local business people will have the right kind of infrastructure to grow their businesses. The middle classes and the working classes and the poor also have opportunities for recreation and for their children to grow up in the right kind of atmosphere with the appropriate level of dignity that they're all entitled to as well. But above all, one of the big mistakes that all of us make is that we all like cutting ribbons, so we want new things all the time, okay? Whereas the key challenge that we actually face is to get the basic things in our cities working. And if we get the basic things working, a pothole appears today, it's fixed up by tonight. A robot is not, traffic lights that are not working today, at 12 o'clock, 2 o'clock, a technician is there to fix it. I won't tell you what this city does, but I think on the whole you're okay. There's some room for improvement. But if we get the basics right, the rest will begin to take care of itself. If we attend to the emergencies and the things that irritate our citizens, they will know that you are acting in their interest, at least in relation to simple things like, why don't I have electricity for 4 hours? And if I have a complaint, don't ask me to phone a call center that can't tell me anything, except thank you for calling, I'll let you know. So there's many things that I think we in local government and in government more generally can learn about service to people. Because as ordinary citizens, you don't want the irritation of phoning half a dozen times, right? But at the same time, there will be these technology companies that will come to you and say, here's the most modern software. Here's the most modern call center technology. And what it basically means is take human beings out and put machines there. It's going to get worse in the next few years because with artificial intelligence, less and less human beings are going to be required. So preparation of accounts, writing of letters will all be done by machines. It's already happening in the legal profession. The lowest categories of lawyers, the new people who get into the business, don't write contracts anymore. The machines write it for them. Because artificial intelligence can be trained to write some of the basic contracts, documents, letters, like Mr. George, you're owing us 1,000 rands, please pay tomorrow or else. In the past, the human being did it. But today, Mr. George will receive a letter from a machine at the end of the day. So that kind of responsiveness, ladies and gentlemen, is absolutely key. Two more points about leadership, and then I'll tell you what the relationship is as I see it with investment processes. The first of those 2 points is that it's very important for us, whichever political party we belong to, and that might be governing a particular city, to build as many relationships and coalitions as possible so there's an optimum involvement of citizens and organized citizens in whatever it is that we do. Because that then builds the right kind of consensus culture that we actually require and that is in tune with African culture as well. The second element of leadership that I think we need to be watchful about is the right kind of integrity and ethics in the way we do things. That is both from a business point of view and from a politician's point of view as well. Because corruption is not a public sector disease, it's a societal disease. It has people from both sides. You have foreigners coming to offer bribes, and you'll have locals who will also offer all sorts of incentives to public officials to do the wrong thing, sign the wrong documents, and agree to the wrong things as well. And in our experience, the public, again, is very alive to the fact that there is this thing called corruption that we need to avoid. And if you want to turn it around in a more positive sense, what we want is good governance with the right kind of integrity and the right ethical practices as well. So it'll be good if we as a continent begin to set our own standards about what we think is the right thing to do rather than be told by anybody else. But what is clear from an investment point of view is investors want to see leaders who actually have what we described earlier on, a clear vision for their cities. They know that you have the right kind of planning capability within your cities. They know that basic services like electricity, water, refuse removal, waste management are all competently actually handled. They want continuity of service. You mustn't get water for 5 hours and they get cut for 2 days, because then you can't have a production facility that needs water for 3 shifts of people to work in a particular environment. So if we can guarantee those things, we will attract both local investors, investors from other parts of the continent, and investors from the rest of the world, because we in Africa don't have enough capital to invest. And when we don't have enough capital, you've got to find out how you're going to create an attractive environment for investors to come in. The second thing, I'm afraid, is that there's a lot of educational work that all of us need to do amongst particularly Western investors. Many of them still see Africa as one country. So if they say there's trouble somewhere in X part of the continent, they'll say, isn't that your neighbor? When you come from the southern part of your continent. And so a greater awareness of who are we, what do we have to offer, why is it that investors should actually come to our continent, and how do we build the right kind of synergies between what we need and what they have to offer is the key. And in doing so, we need to work with our financial institutions to make sure that we mitigate the risks as they perceive it, so that we encourage more and more people to invest in the continent, although it's beginning to actually happen. But the perception is still that Africa, inverted commas, is still a risky place to actually invest in. And that is, again, where if leaders communicate confidence, if they communicate good knowledge about their situations, and they communicate stability in their particular environments, then it's citizens as a whole that will benefit, because those investments will lead to jobs, it will lead to local supply chains being generated, and other benefits economically speaking as well. But at the same time, we don't want to bend our backs so far back that we don't have a spine left at the end of the day. And so we must be quite clear about what kind of investor requirements we're prepared to meet, and what kind of investor requirements are not going to be in our interest to meet. And that's a conversation that I'm sure that if the different organizations that are here undertake, it'll be very useful for all of you to actually be involved in. But there are things that cities can do, and leaders within cities can do to make an investment process easier. Because investment in South Africa, or investment in Kenya, or Tanzania, or Zambia, or Senegal, doesn't happen in some airy-fairy place called the country. Every investment takes place in a locality. It takes place in an area under the influence of a municipal structure of one sort or another. So, the extent to which municipalities can give water connections, electricity connections, registration facilities for businesses, cut out the red tape, don't ask for bribes when people want to actually get things done, and generate what some of our countries are already doing on the continent, where they're very responsive, they act fast, and they're known to be business-friendly in the sense that their technical processes don't act as obstructions to the investment process itself. And so it is important that we create the right climate. Again, it's very basic things that we are talking about. But one of the things that I think at a local government level we also need to discuss is in the budgeting exercises of local governments, how much of the money that we collect from the public is used for consumption purposes or operational purposes, and how much of the money is actually set aside for investment and maintenance of infrastructure. It's a problem that we've seen in South Africa as well, where often much of the budget is used for operational purposes, very little is invested, even in maintenance of infrastructure, which means you have to replace that infrastructure in 15 years rather than 30 years, because you haven't maintained it properly. So there are, I think, interesting lessons, I'm sure, that you can share amongst yourselves in this particular regard. So let me conclude by saying that responsible leadership that understands context and history, that has a very clear vision about where they want to take the country or their particular societies, how to combine economic growth with all the sustainability issues that have been mentioned by other speakers, and creating the right kind of climate for businesses and job creation and enterprise creation to thrive. All of those are the responsibilities that leaders around the continent, I think, need to take onto their shoulders and ensure that they provide the kind of inspiration on the one hand, but also inspire the kind of confidence that will ensure that people that live in those municipalities and indeed in those countries enjoy an ever-increasing standard of living, that children grow up in accordance with all the human rights charters that we have and the children's charters that we have, and that at the end of the day, we can say that African cities are indeed on a new trajectory. One of the challenges, I think the program director mentioned earlier on, is that conferences don't produce results. Conferences can give you the networks that you require. They can useful opportunities for us to exchange ideas. But the final test for us is when we go back home, what are we doing practically? And when you reconvene in this kind of forum, are you able to report and say, from the last time that we met, here are 3 or 4 things that we've concretely achieved, which demonstrates both urgency on the one hand and the seriousness with which we want to change Africa into a dynamic continent on the other hand. Thank you very much.